Welcome to the Trap House Podcast. My name's Justin Jett. Thanks for tuning in for episode 3. Should be a good one here. We'll be chatting with Charlie Mashek and Geriann Albers, the Indiana State Furbearer Biologist. So she's a wealth of knowledge and worked on numerous studies and topics across the country, not just here in Indiana. So we'll be sitting down and chatting with her. And we just finished up the 7B fur sale, and we'll be doing the next podcast, episode 4, will be about that and fur prices in general. So you'll have something to look forward to. Hopefully I'll have that out real soon after this one. I'm going to keep it current as possible. So just want to give everyone a heads up. But before we get into it with Geriann and Charlie, I want to say visit HoosierTrapperSupply.com. Hoosier Trapper's the sponsor of this show. He's got anything and everything you probably need to get going on your trap line adventure. So check us out online, or you could always just give us a call here at the shop and ask anything. We're here 6 days a week, so myself or Charlie or somebody's here to help you with anything. But yeah, so far so good. Episodes 1 and 2 have been great feedback. Love the support. We have spread out on numerous platforms, so things are going good. I appreciate everyone sharing things and commenting, coming up to me at the Boat Sport and Travel Show and telling Charlie how much he loves, what we're doing. So the love and support is good. So we're going to keep it rolling. But let's get it started. Thanks for joining us. All right, we're here with a special guest today, Geriann Albers. She's the Indiana Furbearer Biologist, and she hung around with Charlie and I after the 7B fur sale here in central Indiana. So,
thanks for having me.
Yeah,
glad to be here.
Thanks for being here, for sure.
So you were actually here today checking out muskrat skins.
Yep. Looking at dry pelts for sex and age ratios. Do you want me to talk about that now? Or do we
might as well.
Dive right into that, and then we can talk a little bit about my background afterwards?
Actually, let me jump in here real quick. And for those of you that listen if you're not an Indiana resident, a lot of this will apply to other states too, as far as studies being done. And I know the Furbearer biologists from other states will get together and discuss things at least once or twice a year. And so a lot of this crosses over to a number of other states. So
and a lot of the things that I do regularly for my job are obviously what the Furbearer biologists in your state probably
do as well.
Very similar things as well.
Yeah.
Maybe not the exact same surveys, but the kind of work we're doing is generally the same across states. So
right. So this is an Indiana exclusive conversation. This will pertain to anyone interested in fur bearers and furbearer management and that kind of thing. So, But anyways.
So I was here today looking at muskrat pelts. There's an old technique they developed in the 1940s where you can look at the dried pelts from the trapper harvest and see whether the animal was male or female and whether it was an adult or juvenile. So more than a year or less than a year. Because muskrats, when they're going into their first year of priming up, they prime up in a really consistent pattern. It's very symmetrical, and it kind of looks like this old musical instrument called the lyre in a lot of cases, because they call it the lyre pattern. So if we see that, we can tell that the animal's a juvenile and is just going through its first molt, its first prime up for the winter. And so we can get age classes and sex ratios, and we can use that to kind of monitor reproduction and if we're having any issues. Because if we suddenly see no females, that's obviously concerning because they're the main ones who breed. Females are the important ones, as I like to remind men all the time. Females are the important ones. And if we suddenly see no juveniles, that means something must have happened to our reproduction as well. So we kind of just look for red flags that way. And it's a pretty cost-effective survey we can do. Luckily, Indiana has several fur takers chapters and the Indiana State Trappers that all have fur sales. So I go around to all 5 fur sales this time of year and look at muskrat pelts for those reasons. And I think we're over 2,000 pelts we looked at this year.
That's good. I mean, when I was a kid, if there was water, there was muskrats. And we hear that across the Midwest from other trappers that are my age or maybe a little bit younger. And they everybody talks about back in the day when everybody was a muskrat trapper and I always So it's kind of like bluegill fishing, because once you find them, you can just catch a bunch of them, you know. So and it was, you know, it was a good time, but
Not
obviously
so much now.
no, not so much now. And of course, your study is because they seem to be declining in numbers in some places,
That's
or
true.
in a lot
There's
of places.
actually a research paper published. Adam Albers, I think he was at Illinois Natural History Survey at the time, but he's a professor at Kansas State now, and he looked at muskrat harvest throughout the entire United States, or continental United States at least, and most states are declining, even when you correct for things like pelt price, right? So he actually put in correction factors for, prices are going to change depending on the market, and harvest is then going to change accordingly. That makes sense, but he actually corrected the numbers for pelt price, and we're still, most states except some of the like prairie pothole country in the Dakotas, their muskrats seem to be doing fine,
Right.
but a lot of the rest of us are seeing declines. And I think Indiana was actually in the 40 to 49% decline since 1970
That
range.
I mean,
That's
That's
fairly
about-
significant.
very significant.
Yeah.
But I would, you know,
Also
just
seems to make sense with
Yeah.
your personal knowledge.
yeah, because I've been
Yeah.
around since then, you know. So
Yeah, and if any trapper wants to look that paper up, a good source for looking up those kinds of things is something called Google Scholar. You just do google.com and /SCHOLAR, and you can actually find scientific articles about a lot of the research. Like if I mention a research project, you can look up Adam Albers' paper and see, because he has some nice maps in there, the percentage decline of different states. Some of the southeastern states seem to have been hit harder than some of the, upper Midwest states and things like that. So good way to go look for that kind of scientific-y stuff.
right. So what do you as a educated guess, because I know you guys probably aren't at the point where you can make a definitive statement as to the decline.
why.
Right.
Yeah.
So what are you thinking?
So there's a lot of postulated reasons. There's a lot of guesses as to why it's happening, but we don't really know anything for sure. Some of the potential things are habitat changes, and not just like pristine, because obviously our water quality is better than it was in the 1970s when the environmental movement kicked in, right? So, but there's still changes to habitat happening even in our farming practices, because guys tell me they used to pull them out of ag ditches all the time. Now as we get bigger farms, they have less ditches, and I think we're not seeing muskrats in some places like that we used to. So it's not even habitat changes as in we're losing beautiful pristine wetlands. I think it's other types of habitat changes. I think it's like changes in ag practices and changes in our wetlands and stuff like that. That's a possibility. We're considering things like potential contaminants to the water, stuff like heavy metals and pesticides, and even things like pharmaceuticals. We don't know how any of those affect muskrats. Invasive species are a big question. Some of the states are starting to get a hybrid cattail, and we don't know how muskrats feel about hybrid cattails. There's actually a study going on around Lake Superior right now to see how muskrats are using some of those hybrid cattails and things like Phragmites, which really start choking out some of our water sources.
Yeah.
We're not sure muskrats love Phragmites. It's so thick they might not.
Is that an invasive, or is that okay? It's not native to.
No.
Okay. And I'm
I think
assuming
it's Asian, maybe. I'm not a plant person, but
so that was probably something that was originally planted as a decorative and then just took over.
It took over, spread like wildfire.
Yeah, because there's a pond near where I get off the interstate and it's just full of it. So
yeah, and then predators are another question mark we have. Not even just things like river otter, which many states have reintroduced in that time since the 70s, but also things like our avian predators, our hawks and
birds
stuff
of
we're
prey.
doing. Birds of prey were doing real bad in the 70s because of things like DDT, and a lot of them have recovered really well. So are we seeing less muskrats just because our predation's back to where it was
at one time,
historically at one time? So there's a lot of questions and not really a lot of answers right now. But the Midwest Furbearer Biologists get together every year, usually around May. So that's coming up here first week of May, I think. And we're actually doing a joint meeting this year with the Southeastern Furbearer Biologists, and we're gonna have a whole session on muskrats, and then we're gonna have a kind of panel discussion on should we think about some regional muskrat research and what are states doing, what research is happening right now on muskrats, and what are we learning to try to inform us moving forward on that topic, because it's something we're all aware of is a thing, and we all want to see our muskrats still be healthy.
Sure.
And just because they're at a lower level than they used to be doesn't mean populations aren't still healthy, but it's definitely concerning, right? When you have that much of a drop, if you drop 40 to 49%, you want to make sure there's not something wrong.
Right.
So.
One thing I might add too is the decline in numbers coincided with the fur prices actually going down. So when the fur prices were high, we consistently, year in, year out, a lot of muskrats were caught. And then as the market declined, and guys were not out trapping like they were in the 70s and early 80s particularly, they have declined since then. So it didn't have anything to do with harvest numbers at all.
Yeah, it doesn't seem to be tied to that, because even when pelt prices jumped back up in 2012 and 13, we didn't see harvest rates at like we had been in the 70s.
Right. It was, yeah.
It was a little bit of a bump, but nowhere near what it was.
Right.
So, it seems to be independent of harvest, basically.
One thing that the inconsistency, retention ponds, which should be full of all kinds of chemical from yard treatment, a lot of times have muskrats in them.
Yep.
And the nuisance trappers, which drives me crazy to think that they're out catching them in May, June, and July. I mean, that's their job, and that's what they do. But it is a resource because they're all destroyed. And so that that's one of those things that I think is just odd that they live in that condition. And then, of course, we have some of our marsh areas that are overall done pretty well.
Goose Pond
Goose
in
Pond
Indiana is a big one.
Yeah. But the guys that trapped it this year, in fact, I was just talking to a couple guys here, and they were disappointed in the numbers this year too there. So, but I don't.
And I mean, muskrats do cycle naturally.
Right.
So how much of that is remnant of a larger decline, and how much of that is we're just kind of tipping down a little bit? It's hard to parse that out.
Right. I mean, I would assume that if it was like that for 10 years over there, then it would be more concerning.
And that's the thing. The 1970 to now decline is what's concerning. The individual year to year, we're like, well, there could be some things happening. But the fact that a lot of states have gone down that much since that period, that's what's really raising some red flags with some of us. So yeah, with some of those retention ponds, it makes you wonder. We just here in Indiana did an urban mallard study on all those ducks, all the mallards that sit on those retention ponds and on those suburban areas and stuff like that. And it's like, are those actually places where they're producing more ducks that go to other places? Or is that kind of a place where they go, but then they eventually just get sick and die there, or they stay there forever and they never leave?
Right.
And they're finding that actually the mallards in that case, I think we had an Indiana mallard harvested in like Nevada or Idaho, something crazy out west.
Really?
It went a really far distance. Yeah. I just saw a presentation on it.
So
the question with muskrats is that, are those retention ponds actually, like, as a wildlife biologist, we think about source and sink. The source is what supplies the animals. That's where all the good reproduction's happening. And the sink's where they kind of all go and die, more or less. It's an oversimplification, but that's kind of the idea. The source is where the good breeding happens. The sink's where they live for a while, but they're not reproducing as much. You wonder, are those retention ponds basically sinks where they go when they hang out, but then they're not really heavily reproducing there?
Yeah.
So that's an interesting population dynamic thing that we don't have a good answer to.
And a lot of times the retention ponds don't really have a food source. I mean, it's just like mowed lawn clear to the edge.
What are they there eating? It's not like they're full of cattails.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say. There's hardly any vegetation-wise because they clean it up so much.
And it's not like there's good water lilies or sedges or anything in there.
Yeah, and I'm much younger than you, Charlie, as you know. So I wasn't around for...
I'm the old man of the group.
I wasn't around for these stories of catch them in every ditch, every creek around the house. Right. For me, when I started trapping, if someone gave me permission or pointed me in a direction, it was normally a neighborhood retention pond for the most part. So it's kind of interesting to hear all this, and I'm kind of like...
Yeah, we don't really know how those fit into muskrat life cycles.
I think it's not an easy answer, I don't think. There's just way too many issues and
variables.
So many numbers. If I tried to
do one research project that looked at predators and invasive species and habitat and like retention ponds versus wetlands versus lakes and all these other things, diseases, contaminants, like... I don't think wildlife has enough money for me to do that.
Yeah, that's quite an extensive study. Yeah,
way beyond our funding abilities, basically. So it's really hard to answer. And that's the thing. If you try to answer one piece of it, how do you know that hasn't changed when you try to go answer the other piece of it?
Kind of like working a puzzle. If one piece isn't right, the other piece isn't going to fit right.
Ain't going to fit right either.
Right.
So it's really tough with muskrats to actually get good answers to those questions, but we're trying to like chip away at what we can.
Right. Just to back up, I've always heard muskrats have typically 3 litters a year, and the first litter has a litter by the end of the summer. Is that true, or is that?
That's for the most part accurate. Depends on their food sources. They can have up to 4 litters in a year. Most have 2 or 3, and they can breed at 6 months of age. So usually if it's an early spring, they will be having a litter of their own by the end of the year.
And I'm assuming as well, even in the years when we had quite a few muskrats, that the mortality rate on those is quite high, I would think.
Probably. Yeah, usually if you... It's hard for a wild animal to live that's first year of its life. That's usually their highest chance of mortality. And muskrats only live to be 2 or 3 anyway. Yeah. They're not a long-lived species. They're one of our animals who reproduces a lot and lives a short life.
And they're low on the food chain. I mean, that's part of the...
Everything eats them. They're delicious.
Yeah.
If you're not eating some of your muskrats, you should try it.
Yeah.
So, muskrat meatloaf.
They're pretty tasty.
Yeah.
So
that's interesting. You brought up the study of like how much time you could spend on just one subject. That's the article you were talking about, the guy doing the nationwide study. That's a lot to deal with.
Yeah, think about it. I have 12 species here in Indiana. Some states have even more than that, but I have 12 species, and that's just one of them and all the things I have to think about for that one animal that I'm supposed to be managing and researching and educating people on.
Which is really cool, because we were just talking about earlier that off the podcast. Since I was a kid, we have gained river otters, which were reintroduced.
Yep.
But we've also gained coyotes.
Which were not.
No, the DNR did not turn those loose. Those
all.
Yeah,
can we verify that real quick one more time?
100%. Indiana DNR never reintroduced coyotes.
We hear
They've
that
actually. We have fossil records of coyotes in Indiana going back like thousands of years.
I mean, so
they were in Angel Mounds. There's an archaeological site at Fishers that pulled out coyote bones. Like, there's records all through the 1860s and 90s. We had bounties on them to the 60s. Like, guys, we've had these guys a while.
So it's a native species, but they've just basically reclaimed their original ground.
They rebounded after the 1970s and probably actually even expanded into places they weren't. Because I think from what they can determine, coyotes in Indiana were mostly plains species, which means northwest corner of Indiana, right? Because they probably weren't in Hoosier National in the southern part of the state. That's probably true for states like Illinois, too. The forest and southern part probably had wolves and gray foxes, but not coyotes, and coyotes were in the more prairie portions.
Okay.
So we actually probably, because we got rid of all of our wolves, now have coyotes over a larger portion of our state than we used to, but we have always
had coyotes.
Have had coyotes.
So it's not an invasive, since it's a native.
Correct. At
one time.
Yeah. And even some of our species, this is adjacent, I guess, red foxes are actually, for them, we believe, not native.
That's what I understand.
But we don't consider them invasive because they don't drive out our native species. So that's an important distinction with the word invasive.
Okay.
Invasive means it causes harm or pushes out a native animal.
Okay.
So things like red fox, which don't do that, but are technically, we think most of the lower 48 got our red foxes from introductions into Europe. And the most recent research that I saw is still a few years old now. They think we had red foxes in North America, but they were mostly a boreal forest animal, like way up north Canada. And a lot of the continental U.S. and more southern portions into like Mexico and stuff had gray foxes. But then Europeans brought over a bunch of reds for hunting, and now we have red foxes through a lot of the lower 48 as well. But we consider them a naturalized species.
Okay.
So they're not invasive, not kicking anything else out, but we think they're technically were not here historically.
That's interesting, and I've heard that, but
I've never heard that. That's pretty interesting.
But like pheasants are not native.
Exactly, but they don't kick anything out either. So they're a naturalized species. Rainbow trout are the same way. Rainbow trout aren't kicking out bass or anything like that. So, most of our rainbow trout in Indiana are stocked, as are most eastern rainbow trout populations, but we don't consider them an invasive species.
Right.
And coyotes can't fall into that list because they are a native.
Yeah. So how'd you get started in all this?
Oh, yeah. Backing up.
Yeah.
So I actually didn't grow up hunting or trapping at all. I fished a little bit with my grandpa. But I liked being outside, but I feel like I like being outside in like a farm kid way, where I'd like swim in the pond and run around the fields and, go in the cow pasture with my uncle and stuff like that, kind of being outside. But I was always obsessed with animals. I would always I like to read a lot, but when I would sit in the car, I'd always be staring out the window because I'm looking for any animal on the side of the road. Domestic or wild, I didn't care. I just wanted to see animals.
Right.
And I was one of those little girls who was obsessed with horses and all that stuff. And then I was always active in 4-H and FFA once I got into high school a little bit. And I was on a track when I went to my undergrad at the University of Illinois. I toured the campus, loved it, wanted to go there. I applied to the College of Agriculture thinking I was going to go into animal science, like more the domestic animal side. And they sent me this book after they accepted me of here's all the majors we offer in the College of Agriculture. And I was flipping through it, and I hit on this College of Natural Resources, and I saw this fish and wildlife major, and I'm like, oh, well, that's what I want. That's what I've always wanted. I didn't know this was a thing that people could do. So I kind of picked my major that way, just basically reading what was offered through the University of Illinois. And, so I got my natural resources degree there with focus in fish and wildlife. And after that, I spent 3 years working what we call tech jobs in the wildlife field. So it's basically you go work for anywhere from 3 months to a couple years on different research projects, either universities or states are doing to help them out, just collecting field work. So I've been, and even while I was in my undergrad at Illinois, I would work summer jobs out doing field work is what we call it, basically collecting data for research projects. So I helped out with a river otter project in southern Missouri when they were doing some scat surveys and stuff like that. And worked on, after I graduated, went out west to California and tracked badgers out there at what is now a national monument, Fort Ord. If any of you are listening from California, we were tracking badgers on that property. And we apparently alerted them that they had burrowing owls because they didn't know that, but we were driving around at night.
Well, that's
so
cool.
We were like, you guys know you have burrowing owls, right? And they're like, what? No. And then they all rushed out and did surveys to figure out they had burrowing owls because we would just see those guys all the time. They're really neat. But that was a fun project. The thing about tracking animals is a lot of times you still don't get to see them. So, I think I saw one badger, and I was in California tracking badgers every day for like 3 or 4 months, and I saw one actual badger that whole time. So, and then after that, what did I do after that? I think after that is when I went out to New York. And I worked on an urban coyote project out there, north of the city in Westchester County. So I was in the very urban part of New York, running coyotes around. Did a little bit of trapping and collaring out there. We did some scat surveys and howling surveys, and then a lot of telemetry, which means trying to figure out where the coyotes that have collars on them are. And that was a pretty interesting project because you're really seeing how urban coyotes use the landscape. Like, one of our coyotes was not that far from where, like, the Clintons' house was. Like, there are rich people who lived in this area. Like, technically, Richard Gere was my neighbor, sort of.
Yeah.
Because they actually had this field house in one of the county parks that was still, like, it was a big park. I think it was, like, 1,000-acre county park. It was huge, but they had a field house in it, which is where I lived. And apparently, his property had joined the south side of the property.
Well, that's...
But it was a weird dynamic because I lived in the middle of a park on the north end of the county, but then I could be on the train in New York City proper in like an hour. So it was, and I was mostly chasing coyotes around suburban habitats. So it's kind of interesting to see how they really stick to the green space, even though there's so many houses there. Mm-hmm. Like if I couldn't find somebody, I'd be like, all right, I'm going to go to this cemetery and this beltway, and they're probably going to be in one of those two places. Like urban coyotes love cemeteries. So if there's a college campus that had some parkland or something, they might be in there. But they'll take little trips into yards to look for food. But they spend a lot of their time in
working the edges,
working the green spaces, and having dens in the green spaces and stuff like that. It was pretty interesting. And that was actually the first of 2 urban coyote projects I worked on, because I also worked in the one in Chicago, the Chicago Urban Coyote Study, and it's been going on for
quite a while.
I think they're over 15 years now. They've been tracking urban coyotes and what they're doing.
Right.
And if anybody's ever been to Chicago, there are coyotes on Navy Pier, which is one of the most touristy boardwalk places. It just goes right out into the lake. And they got a coyote that would hang out on Navy Pier and clean up trash and rats at night. But they can live in surprisingly urban areas.
They're an amazing animal.
Yeah,
they can adapt to just about anything.
They're my favorite animal.
Yeah, they're my favorite animal too, actually. I think we don't give them enough credit for being like ourselves. Like, humans live in all habitat types. You can slap a coyote into any habitat type and it's going to figure out a way to eke out a living.
Right.
So I think they're survivors, kind of like humans are.
Yeah.
We kind of make do wherever we wind up with what food sources we have.
Yeah.
And coyotes are kind of the same way. which I respect about them.
Yeah, they are something. I mean, I think, they really get a bad rap, and even most trappers will say, "Oh, I hate him" or whatever. But if you really push comes to shove, most of them will say, "I love that animal." I mean, they have a great respect for him. So
Can be a challenge to catch, right?
That can be a challenge. Yeah, exactly. And and our type of trapping is a little bit different than some because we don't care if we leave some.
Yeah.
Whereas like a sheep rancher or even a cattle rancher out west, they want every one of them caught, which I don't really agree with that perspective, but they want them all caught because it does affect their income. Which that can become quite challenging because you could always have that straggler that's not very easy to catch. So,
exactly. And actually, usually if you're removing them, then they're more coming in. And
you're creating somewhat of a vacuum. So,
there's kind of a mentality that people are starting to put forth in some situations where if you're having problems, you absolutely need to trap around like sheep and stuff, especially. But if you have those coyotes there and they're not killing your sheep, you might want to actually leave them because they might kick out the ones that would.
Okay.
Kind of thing. So that's something some Western folks are trying to, not all of them, but there's some farmers and ranchers out west that are like, well, they're not killing them right now, so let's just wait and see how this goes instead of trying to remove every single one thing because coyotes don't have a taste for them and they're just eating rabbits and ground squirrels and stuff and they're territorial, so maybe they'll keep out the rogue bad ones that will.
So then I know you worked in Wisconsin technically as a fur-bearer biologist.
Yeah, I was assistant fur-bearer biologist.
Right.
So before that, I was in grad school. So I do have my master's degree. And there I studied coyote diets in West Virginia. And then, I became the assistant fur-bearer biologist and trapper ed coordinator for the Wisconsin DNR.
Okay. Now, was Sean Rossler up there at that time?
I actually took Sean Rossler's job.
Okay.
He went down to Indiana. He came here.
Right.
And then I took his old position. And then I went to North Carolina to be the assistant fur-bearer and black bear biologist. And then Sean went back to Wisconsin. And then I took his job in Indiana.
Right.
So if any of you know Sean Rossler, we've just been chasing each other around the country for a while.
Well, it was cool. When Sean was here, he got our otter season through.
Yep.
So
that started in 2015.
And I always kind of kidded him about, don't leave until we have our Bobcat season in place. But
he did.
Yeah, he didn't stick around.
He went.
Shame on you, Sean, if you're listening.
How dare you?
We're upset.
Although I don't blame him because he got to go back. That was his home state, so I don't.
Yeah.
And also, I guess you mentioned North Carolina, and just to give you a compliment, a number of North Carolina trappers that I've talked to that worked with you there had nothing but good things to say about you, and they were upset that you had left their state. So
they were a good group.
Yeah, so that was
able to take the next step and be the fur bear biologist. I'm what did my supervisor jokingly called me, the fur bear empress for Indiana. With moving up because I was still an assistant down there. Also, like black bears are fine, but they're too big. I like to work with animals where I can easily carry them in my arms, and black bears do not fit that bill. So,
and they're not really a fur bear.
Nope.
That's
large
a
carnivore,
game animal, or depending on the class.
We put them with large carnivore. So them cougars and wolves we generally stick in a large carnivore category.
Yeah.
So only things smaller than that are usually assigned the fur bearer tag.
Yeah. Does fur bear the idea of fur bear classification, does that also correspond to an animal that has a monetary value? So
mostly they're pretty much put together because their fur had commercial value for being made into clothing. So that's the thing with like wolves and bears and cougars. You're not really. Yes, Britain uses bear fur on their big tall black hats at the Buckingham Guard folks. But for the most part, if you're making like a coat or a hat, you're not using those types of fur. And that's why even rabbits and squirrels aren't fur bearers.
Right, they're game animals.
Yeah, they're small game for us is the category that they're in. But they're not fur bearers because they didn't have the same value for being made into clothing that some of the other ones did. So I have quite a few carnivores. I have 2 rodents, muskrat and beaver, and then I have our marsupial, the Virginia opossum. So
our only North American marsupial. Right.
Well, there's technically some in Central America, so it depends on only Canada and United States marsupial. Okay. There's some in Mexico and Central America. There's some other ones.
Okay.
There's actually dozens of species of possums. So if you go to South America and say possum, they're going to be like, which one? Because there's a lot of them.
So all these trappers are going, oh, thank God we've only got one kind here.
Yeah, I mean, be happy we don't have a lot of the brushy-tailed possum and the sugar possum and all the other possums that run around down there.
We call them trap cloggers.
But one thing I learned from all the antis at some of the hearings was how many ticks they eat and how valuable they are, and these ticks. And it made me laugh because it's like, well, they probably, if there's a tick there, they probably eat it, but it's not like they go out
search for it.
Searching.
Yeah.
It was just a ridiculous perspective. But
I actually know where that came from. So there was a research project out of New York where they were looking at Lyme disease, and they had some animals in a lab setting. In cages, basically, where they put ticks on them to see like retention of ticks on animals, like how many ticks could these different types of animals host, basically. And so they had like rabbits and some mice, and they also had the opossum, and they found that the possum, because they're really diligent groomers, possums are actually pretty clean animals, but their defense mechanism is to make themselves as gross as possible. But they actually they groom themselves like cats do. Like, they're really diligent groomers. So they would find they would groom themselves, and they would pick the ticks off, and they would most of the time eat them. And that's what kind of led to this rumor that possums like hoover up ticks in the environment. But really, it's like if a possum finds a tick on it while it's grooming itself, it will probably eat it, but that doesn't mean it's going foraging for ticks, and it probably is not consuming as many as
the thousands
some
and
of
thousands.
the memes I have seen have suggested.
I mean, that
100 million ticks a month.
Because I gotta say, we got a lot of possums, and we still got a lot of ticks, man.
Yeah,
So,
no kidding.
But that's where that came from. They actually, because they're such diligent groomers, if a tick gets on them, they will actually consume it, because they actually looked at their feces and everything and found that they were in fact eating them. But they're not foraging for ticks.
I mean, if there was a can of cat food there and a tick, they probably would
They're
go
going
to
for
the
the
cat
cat
food.
food.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're going for the cat food. For sure.
That's something we need to really put out there, because I even heard that today. It's like, well, just turn them loose because they eat a lot of ticks. It's like,
and I mean,
You heard that today?
yeah.
Here at a fur sale?
Yeah, which I don't care if they turn them loose. That's
Yeah,
fine.
I mean,
but the
that's cool. Possums eat a lot of carrion. They
Right.
provide us a lot of other services. So
Right.
sure, why not?
yeah, but just to
that's
fall
not a
back to
good-
that
that's
excuse, yeah, that's not a very good one.
not- I actually had someone ask me once how to improve possum habitat because they wanted to reduce ticks, and I didn't have a great answer for them because possums are generalists. I was like, I guess you can put in nest boxes for them because they need den spaces. But what I actually wound up being my main recommendation was removing invasive species, because actually what they found is when it comes to ticks, a lot of our invasive plants hold way more ticks than our native ones do. A lot of the bushy stuff like honeysuckle and autumn olive, there's just a higher concentration of ticks in places like that.
Yeah.
So really taking out your invasive species will do more for you
In the long run.
than trying to attract a few possums.
Or you could just put like a bunch of old cars, and because they like living inside.
Oh yeah, they
them.
probably could have suggested that, basically making a junkyard in their forest, but I'm not sure they would have bought into that.
Went for that one, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I don't know. But you're right. If you think about it, if from all the possums in all my life that I've caught, they're all well groomed.
Yeah.
They're rarely are they, unless they had some more sort of disease issue or skin issue, which some of them seem to have.
Some of them do, yeah.
Yeah, but
Or
otherwise,
get caught it in a mud ball. So
Yeah.
obviously then they're not well groomed.
right. But they always are well groomed. They look pretty good.
Yeah, they're
Better than
good at cleaning themselves.
Better than
They get a bad rap because, like I said, their defense mechanism is just to be as gross as possible. So if they're scared, then they just start exuding everything disgusting they can.
Yeah.
So they get kind of a
Drooling
bad rap.
everywhere
Drooling
and showing
everywhere,
their teeth. Yeah.
oozing out of the back end too. They're just like, don't eat me, I'm gross. But
Yeah.
they're really not most of the time.
And they got that prehistoric mouth that's got way more
All
teeth,
the teeth,
in it than
most teeth of any Indiana mammal, and for I think any North American animal. There's some
really?
armadillo in South America that has more, but in North America, I think they have our most teeth.
Yeah. It's an impressive mouth.
Yeah, it's a cool mouth of teeth.
So you've worked on a lot of different projects across the country. What you've mentioned the muskrat deal. What else is going on here that you're working on? I've heard
In Indiana?
anywhere
Or
Anywhere.
coming up. Yeah.
or coming up. I've heard things about gray fox.
Yes, gray foxes are one, and that's another kind of regional one. Probably not so much for guys in the southeast or northeast, but for some of the central Midwest states, they're seeing some declines in their gray foxes that are concerning. So, like in Indiana, we used to have gray foxes, from what we can tell, back in the 70s statewide, and we were harvesting 10 to 15,000 of them. Now we harvest probably 50 to 100, and they're mostly in southern Indiana, though there's pockets still up north and things like that, a few central counties as well. And states like Ohio, Illinois, Iowa, even parts of southern Wisconsin, they're all kind of seeing the same thing, where they're not seeing as many grays as they used to. And we all are kind of wondering why. And again, kind of like the muskrats, we're not 100% sure why.
Probably a number of factors, yeah.
Probably a number of factors. Again, is predation one of them? Coyotes get blamed a lot here in some of the states, but there are plenty of eastern states that have tons of gray foxes and tons of coyotes. So I think there's probably something else happening too. Coyotes may be part of it, but there's probably something else also going on.
Yeah, Indiana, clearly the correlation between the decline in gray fox and the major proliferation of coyotes definitely corresponded.
Yes.
But we go down to Arkansas and trap, and we catch a lot of gray foxes, and we catch lots of coyotes.
Yeah.
So the two.
Yeah,
it doesn't really jive.
We use in my field is correlation does not equal causation.
Yeah.
Just because two things follow the same trend doesn't mean that they're necessarily related.
Right.
There's some weird science memes online where they're like, the number of homes this person owns correlates with insect populations. There's like weird stuff like that you can make, and it doesn't mean they're in any way related. But I mean, coyotes probably will kill gray foxes. Bobcats might too, and so we don't really know how that's affecting them. But again, that can't be it's unlikely to be the only thing that's going on with ours. Habitat's another big question. There used to be a lot of, fence rows around smaller farms and stuff like that. A lot of that's gone. Is that a problem with our gray foxes? Is disease an issue? They seem to be particularly susceptible to a specific strain of canine distemper. And we have a lot of raccoons who occasionally have distemper outbreaks. Is that spilling over to our gray foxes? Is there some other disease they have that we don't know about really?
Yeah.
Is parvovirus a problem that kills a lot of pups? Canines can get it. We don't even know if that's an issue we need to be worrying about. And we also don't know, for Indiana, we don't know if things like inbreeding are a problem. If we have just small pockets up north as part of that because there's not new ones moving in, and therefore they're becoming inbred or something like that, So we're here in Indiana starting a big research project next January, so January of 2020, to look at some of the stuff for our gray foxes. We're going to put out GPS collars to see what kind of habitat they're using, and then what does that mean for how much habitat is available in Indiana, and do we have gray foxes and what we think of as gray fox habitat based upon what our collared ones are doing. Can we figure that out when they die exactly what killed them? And we're going to look at inbreeding and diseases and probably even also diet a little bit since we'll have gray foxes on hand. And there are a couple other states that are also trying to get together a proposal, Iowa, Illinois, and Ohio being three of them, to try to get to some joint funding to do similar work in those states at the same time we are. So we could have, if some of that goes through, we could have a cool opportunity for some regional gray fox information, which would be really neat.
Right.
So it's going to be a really big project. They gave me more money than I thought they would.
What?
I thought I was gonna get a hard no, but they've given me the money I asked for.
That's state funding or federal?
That is PR, Pittman Robertson.
Okay.
Which you pay into if you're buying firearms or ammunition or archery equipment. Yeah. So go buy more ammo so I can do more gray fox research. And then also, actually no license fee money will go into that project because the researcher puts up for those federal funds, the state has to have what we call match. So they have to put up 25%, and then the federal pot of money puts up 75%. But actually what we do when we do research is we get the researchers to put up the 25%, and then we use the federal money for the rest of it.
Okay.
So there's actually not any state license fees
for the study.
Project. Yeah. Which is kind of nice because then the researcher provides that and saves us a little money so we can do other habitat kind of stuff or other surveys and things with those state license fees.
Right.
So,
and you had mentioned one time that I was talking to you, this is some time ago, that it actually might just be the new normal.
Yeah, I'm trying to keep an open mind. Obviously that decline in harvest seems concerning.
Makes you wondering, yeah.
Yeah, it makes you wonder what's going on. But there is a chance because we don't have data from before that. We don't know what gray foxes looked like in the 1800s or the 1950s even. It is possible because we were suppressing so many of our predators in the 70s. Like we were keeping red foxes down. Coyotes were very sparse. We didn't really have any bobcats, right? We just didn't have a complex predator community. Even our raccoons were really, really low because we did raccoon reintroductions in the 70s, right? Yeah. So we didn't have a lot of our other, what we call mesocarnivores, all those medium-sized things. So there is a chance that gray foxes just became kind of overinflated because there was nothing else.
Right.
And this is actually where we used to be historically, and we just don't know because we don't have the data. So that's really why... Because people ask me, like, why aren't you doing something about the season or setting a bag limit or something? And I really want to do this research first to make sure I'm making an informed decision. Because there's a chance if we're not having disease issues and the survivors of adults is 70 to 80% and the survival of pups is 30 to 50%, which is pretty typical for predators, and we're not seeing high one cause of mortality being super high, and we're not seeing genetic inbreeding problems, that our foxes are... fine.
Right.
But this is just where they live now. So I'm trying to keep an open mind and not assume the world is falling apart with gray foxes until I have more data to show me that the world is or is not falling apart when it comes to gray foxes.
Well, we talked to a lot of trappers, and they there's a lot of them that are turned loose if they're caught. Mm-hmm. So, relatively speaking, the percentage of catch is a fair amount of them are turned loose. Yeah, that's the thing.
Part of harvest decline may have been that guys just let them go now.
Yeah, because they know that there's not that many.
Because they know that there's not that many.
And red foxes even get turned loose by guys just partly just. They kind of feel bad for them, so it's like...
And our red foxes were heading down too, but they seem to have stabilized and bounced back a little bit now. It's possible with coyotes jumping up so high, they had to find a new equilibrium. They had to find the new place where they're both going to be kind of stable at these new levels kind of thing. Because even our coyotes have leveled off and even ticked down slightly now. So I think we had our big boom of coyotes, and now we're kind of settling down to maybe a more... what will be normal coyote levels for us, but we'll need a few more years to see if that holds true or not.
Yeah. The red foxes seem to be more in the urban areas. They're living under people's mini barns and all kinds of stuff like that. But.
Yeah, there's some interesting theories and even some research happening on that front, because there's this idea that this phenomenon is happening, that red foxes have kind of figured out if they are close to people, they're safer from coyotes.
Yeah.
Because like I just was talking about the urban coyote research, right, where they hang out in green spaces a lot. Mm-hmm. Or in cemeteries and parks and beltways and things like that. In urban areas, foxes go right up into people's yards.
Right.
People don't have the same concerns with the adorable little red fox that they do with the coyote they think is going to walk off with their pets and might walk off with their pets. And there's actually some research going on in like Madison, Wisconsin, to see how are they using this urban space, and if red foxes kind of figured out that being closer to people means they're safer, and that's part of why they're doing better, is they've just figured out this new niche to use that they weren't before, that kind of avoids where coyotes are most common and most likely to kill them or compete for food sources. So it's pretty interesting, and it'll be interesting to see what all comes out of some of those research projects.
Yeah.
So...
yeah, it seems like when we're trapping, when we catch a red fox, it's always a field where right next to it there's a neighborhood, and you're coming out of people's backyards or whatnot.
We had that one spot though that's one of our best spots, and we caught 7 coyotes right there, but we also caught 2 red foxes right there. But it was not very far from significant urban area too. Yeah. So
they're definitely not mutually exclusive. Coyotes definitely will kill reds, but I think it's more, coyotes seem to have this same, well, it's slightly different, but a similar kind of situation with where there are wolves. Mm-hmm. Like in Wisconsin, where wolf core areas are, coyotes are not.
Right.
Coyotes move into the periphery where they're less likely to get beat up by a wolf. And I think red foxes are kind of doing the same thing, and they're figuring out that some of those places closer to people mean that. But they actually had one of the... that Madison, Wisconsin study that's been going on. They have red foxes and coyotes collared, and they had a coyote that would come up to a red fox den like every 3 days, never try to kill any of the kits, never attack the red fox. They have video of them in like the same frame, the red fox barking angrily at the coyote most of the time. But the coyote never did anything to that red fox, and they were kind of using the same... they would hang out in the same yard sometimes, and nothing negative happened in that particular situation. Is that par for the course? I mean, probably not.
Yeah, exception. Yeah.
That might be the exception instead of the rule, but there are places where they both occur, and it's not a problem. And places where guys can catch both of them. So.
I'm assuming they're partly at each other because of territory and and because of food source.
It's a possibility, yeah, that they trying to keep each other away from good food sources and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So.
And the big guy's always picking on the little guy.
Big guy's always picking on the little guy.
Mother Nature can be cruel.
So Mother Nature works. Big guy picking on little guy.
You mentioned a little bit ago in the 70s, the raccoons were actually reintroduced?
Yeah, a little bit. We still had some raccoons, but they were way down, and in Indiana, they actually did some reintroductions. I know of in the southern part of the state. I don't remember exactly where. Our turkey biologist, Steve Bax, has been here a very, very long time, and he helped to do it, which is the main reason I know about it. Like, one of his early jobs for my agency back in the late 70s was putting out raccoons in some of the southern counties.
You know, I'd always heard that, but I guess this is the first time that anyone's ever just said, yeah. You know, and sometimes you would, you know,
it's kind of like the coyote thing. Is it true or is it not?
That and then you didn't know if it was like a coon hunting club that brought some in and turned them loose illegally, or, you know, kind of like the guys wanted to hunt hogs, so they're let's turn some hogs loose.
Right.
So, you know,
and
great
that's
idea.
What happened with coyotes in the southeast, North Carolina. A lot of them had coyotes because hunters brought them in to chase with
hounds,
hounds and stuff. And
so that's interesting. That, I mean, obviously coons were here, so the reintroduction made sense. And
so with fur bearers, the ones we have introduced in Indiana are beaver, raccoons, otter, and I think that's it, because we didn't reintroduce bobcat either. Some folks think we did, but that was natural expansion into our state.
Right.
So those are the ones that I know for sure. We haven't done any possum or weasel reintroductions that I'm aware of. So I
think we need to do a fisher reintroduction, which I think I mentioned to you at one point.
Yeah, I know. I'm not 100% sure we ever had fisher. There are a few records. Maybe we had a couple, but I'm on board. I love fisher.
Yeah, I mean, you know, Pennsylvania.
I miss having fisher. When I worked in Wisconsin, they were pretty cool.
Yeah, and Pennsylvania had a successful reintroduction. Now they actually have a season.
West Virginia did too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe we can bring them here and not
but they have mountains there. It's a little
be complete, kind of like the red fox. It's not invasive, so to speak, but
it's a cool creature though.
It's not going to hurt anything else, so why not?
Well, then we could turn some porcupines loose, because they prey on porcupines, correct?
Not exclusively, actually. Their diet of porcupines is a lot lower than folks think it is. I think it's like 20% of their diet is.
Oh, so we don't really need
porcupines. So we don't need. What we need is rabbits.
Okay.
And squirrels and some red-backed voles. We don't have any of those, but they eat a lot of red-backed voles.
Okay.
That's more of a northern vole species. I don't think we have any of, but we could probably bring those in too. That would probably be fine. Or they can make do with some of our meadow and forest voles. I mean, we got other woodland voles. I mean, not forest voles. We have other voles for them to eat, though. We might be able to pull it off.
It's an interesting thing to think about or dream about. Since
I doubt my agency would ever get on board with doing that, but it is interesting to think about. It's like, what other animals did we maybe have that we should think about? But it's getting harder and harder to reintroduce things.
I would imagine.
Because of all the kind of human dimensions and possible damage situations that kind of come with reintroductions and stuff like that. So,
well, I mean, I know this is out of your area, but the reintroduction of elk in eastern Kentucky, one of the most successful reintroductions.
Yep.
Probably in the history of reintroductions.
Yeah, when it comes to ungulates especially.
Yeah. I mean, that's crazy what that was, how quickly it went. Mm-hmm. But I know
brought in a lot of animals up front and had all that basically reclaimed mine land.
Right.
And they did very well up there, yeah.
But they're expanding, so that's creating some issues with people that really don't want them around.
Yeah,
so.
We actually tried to reintroduce elk in Indiana. It was a long time ago. I think it was the 60s.
Really?
And it was in Brown County, which there's a big state park there if anybody's been to or who's from Indiana or visits. There's a huge state park called Brown County State Park. It's very popular. Lovely place. You should camp there. Yeah. Put in a plug for our state parks. But they tried to put a few elk there, and they all immediately ran into soybean fields and got shot. They took the last couple and put them in a fence inside the park for people just to look at, because they lost a lot of them too.
That's not a very good "Who's your welcome."
No. So there was a small attempt to do that in Indiana, and it didn't go so well. A lot of other states modern elk reintroductions are going a little better, like Wisconsin and Kentucky's obviously was great, and now some other North Carolina I think is still slowly expanding their elk population, but they're also having crop problems. Around the Great Smoky side, and I think West Virginia is getting their start here this year, reintroducing elk. So, yeah,
that's crazy.
Yeah, it's hard. People have a harder time wrapping their mind around reintroducing predators.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
we got lucky with river otter because they're just so cute looking. A lot of people are on board with those guys because they just think of them as like playful, fun-loving animals.
Right.
Though some people with small ponds full of stocked bluegill would disagree.
That have seen their fish
that have seen
populations
their fish
decline.
I'm pretty sure if you own a fish hatchery, that's the most evil animal in the world. It's the otter.
Yeah, one of probably maybe great blue herons being the other one.
Yeah.
Yeah,
that's
just sit
true.
there and eat a bunch of fish.
And those are fully protected, so you don't really have any
Can't do anything
recourse
with
on
them.
those. Yeah. The interesting thing about the otters, they were, I believe, all came from Mississippi originally. Louisiana. Okay. And they were all caught in like number 11 Long Spring foot traps.
Yep.
So, and held them, and obviously wasn't an issue.
Stuck them in cages and brought them up here, and now we have a lot of them.
And I think they went to Purdue for whatever.
Health assessments, and some of them had transmitters put in them so they could track them and see where they went.
Right. And that was started in 1995, I believe.
1995 in Indiana,
Yeah. And then, of course, it took to 2015 to have a season, but it really didn't need to wait that long.
We didn't need to. And actually, that's relatively quick. If you think about it, that means our population recovered in 20 years.
Which is
pretty fast because, I mean,
That's nothing.
Wisconsin's had elk longer than that, and they just opened a season of 5, I think, last year, maybe?
Yeah.
So that's for a wild animal, that's pretty fast. But that's pretty on par for the course for otters. A lot of times if states reintroduce them, then they recover very quickly. If the good water is there, and fish and crayfish a big thing. If those are there, then the otter do really well.
Right.
Missouri saw the same thing. North Carolina kept otter in the mountains, but they had to put some on the coast to move them around. So Wisconsin had kept their otter. So, but yeah, it is a fast recovery, and they came off the species of special concern list in Indiana in 2012.
Okay.
But they waited a couple more years before moving a season forward.
Right.
So, and Illinois saw the same thing. They reintroduced their otter, and within I think 20 years had a limited season in place. So.
Right. And the one thing I appreciate about what Indiana did with the otter, for those of you out of state, we have a quota of 600 statewide. So once the quota is met, the season's over.
Correct.
Otherwise, it goes to March 15th, which coincides with our beaver season. A trapper is allowed to catch 2 otters, and they have to call it in or register online that they caught their otters, and there were so many days, then they get their CITES tag. But so anybody has the opportunity to catch an otter. We don't have like a pre-selected draw system where you get a tag or whatever, which in some cases ends up in hands of people that don't want to go out and take an otter.
Yeah, I don't know that happens as much as people think that it does. Like, I worked in Wisconsin for 3 years, right? And I helped manage the limited permit system up there. We got complaints. But it is another way to regulate your harvest. But they usually set those permits based on success rates. So they issue proportionally more permits than are going to be caught, hoping to hit the number that's going to be caught. So if trappers the year before had a 30% success rate, they give away proportionally more permits to assume that only 30% of the permits you're going to give are actually going to be successful. And that's how they are regulating that harvest. So if a whole bunch of people get a permit that aren't using it, that means your success rate is going to go down, and the number of permits that are going to be issued are going to go up.
Okay. So
so usually there's ways built into that system to avoid that being a problem. It depends on how the permit system run, but like if you're in Wisconsin, I promise you it's set based on success rates, and there are probably not that many going to people who are opposed to the idea of a season.
Just holding on to them and not using them.
Yeah, just holding on to them.
I mean, we hear that from Illinois guys,
Yeah.
you know, in relation
With
to
the
the
Bobcats.
Bobcats. Yeah. So,
Yeah. And theirs is they don't use success rates yet because their season's pretty new. I don't know if they plan to.
Right.
But they are issuing, like, the quota was 350 maybe this last year, and I think they issued like 1,000 permits. So they're still issuing proportionally more, knowing not everyone is going to be successful.
Right.
So
what do you think about Bobcats in Indiana then?
they're doing really well.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're expanding.
Yeah,
They're pretty much, I consider them common in southern Indiana at this point.
Yeah.
And they're expanding in northern Indiana. They seem to be following a lot of our river corridors. And we actually collared Bobcats in Indiana back from 98 to 2006. down in southern Indiana, south central Indiana. And they got some analysis done at the time, but actually they didn't do kind of all the things they could have with some of the habitat use and stuff like that. So we actually have a postdoctoral student, which means he has a PhD. He is technically a science doctor. So he has his PhD, and now he's working for us to analyze a bunch of our data that we've collected on bobcats over the years, the collaring data, but also some of the we collect bobcat observations on what we call our Archer's Index, which is deer bow hunters who are afield during the fall, report all the wildlife that they see. That's a voluntary survey that we have, and we have a bobcat mortality survey where if we find one dead or someone reports a dead one to us, we keep track of that and how many bobcat mortalities we have every year. So he's taking a bunch of that data and looking at, what kind of home ranges and habitat use that our bobcats have. How are they going to continue to expand in the state? Like, what kind of movement pathways based upon habitat are they likely to use? How many bobcats could we fit in the state based upon what kind of habitat they typically use? And some cool stuff like that. So he's doing a bunch of neat analyses that we should have at the end of this year, end of 2019 here, that we'll be able to start putting out and showing people. So he's currently working on making me, because I took some of our observation data and our roadkill mortality data and our Archer's Index data, and he's supposed to be making me like either a GIF or some sort of time lapse of bobcat expansion in the state by county that we're hoping to be able to put out on social media and stuff, because I think that'll be neat for people to see.
Yeah,
because they don't just run straight up the state, right? So they came into the kind of southwest corner and kind of started moving up some of the river systems,
right,
to the north on the west side, and also spreading southeast. So it's kind of neat to see them kind of expand out the way they did.
A time lapse would be cool of that.
Yeah.
So
yeah, exactly.
And it's interesting. The past couple seasons, this season more than last year, the trappers that have been in the Crawfordsville area are seeing bobcats and sign of bobcats. So obviously that's not in that core area, but they're expanding their.
They're definitely moving more.
Right,
Yeah,
and that would be river related, I'm sure.
Probably. There was some research done in southern Illinois that you can find about how they looked at bobcat expansion north, and it was following a lot of creek corridors, creek and river corridors. So that seems to be, and that kind of looks like it's holding true for us too, because some of our major river systems, like the Tippecanoe and Wabash, are what bobcats seem to be following up north. So we even have bobcats in Marion County, which is where Indianapolis is.
Right.
So there's a few there. And bobcats can be an urban animal. There are bobcats in Los Angeles, California, so it's not unusual for them to be around people in urban areas too. So
right.
Yeah, I'm sure they can adjust well. They're crafty
they're
critters.
They prefer having some trees around, some forests, and it's looking like the habitat of the ones that we collared, because that was still pretty early in bobcat expansion, 1998, when we started collaring those. So they were pretty much picking out kind of whatever habitat they wanted, because we were still pretty low density then. And they liked forested areas. But the people collaring them would always catch them in clear cuts in forested areas. So if there was a clear cut or a nice edge, that's where they'd set their traps and get some collars on them. So it was pretty neat. But they actually I just saw the student, well, he's not a student, the postdoc who's working on that data just did a presentation at our one of our professional meetings. And we had 80% survival of adults on that study.
Oh, really?
Back then. Yeah.
That's pretty significant.
That's pretty high.
Yeah.
Yeah. And most of the mortality that they did have was primarily roadkill.
I mean, there's really no predator above them, though, right?
Humans. Yeah,
That's
no,
it.
we're kind of it.
Yeah.
Yeah, we don't really have anything else. Kittens can get taken by owls, and coyotes will kill kittens and stuff like that. But no, once they're adult, it's really human-caused factors.
Right. And I'm assuming they're susceptible to what, feline distemper?
They do get that. When you look at diseases of bobcats, the one that I know of that really can actually straight up kill the bobcat is actually Panleukopenia, which house cats can get too. Indiana actually had an outbreak in domestic cats. I think last year it was in the news a little bit down in southern Indiana. There was an outbreak in domestic cats of this disease, and basically they get gut issues, and they have severe diarrhea, and they get really dehydrated. So, but they can get other things like feline distemper and stuff like that. But we don't know much about bobcat diseases here. We don't really know prevalence rates or how often our bobcats get it. We don't know for sure feline panleukopenia is in our wild bobcats, because we haven't. That's a topic I've been talking over with our state vet to see if we should be exploring a little more, so we can kind of understand that side of it. But they can get rabies, but They're not one of the main carriers of rabies. And honestly, Indiana is pretty fortunate that we haven't had rabies in a terrestrial animal in a while. I think it was like the 80s. So it doesn't show up too much in like our skunks and our raccoons like it does in some other states. Like we had raccoons every year with rabies out in North Carolina and stuff like that. But we don't get that as often here. So
I think it was moved. It's been several years. Pennsylvania and Ohio, I think, had some, and they were able to basically get it stopped so that it didn't just continue to move west.
Yeah, there's a really interesting effort because there's a couple types of rabies. There's a fox strain, there's a skunk strain, there's a raccoon strain, and I think there's another one I'm missing. I'm not a veterinarian. But the raccoon strain is what they call the furious strain. I'm doing air quotes for those of you listening, which basically means it's the one that you think of when you think of Old Yeller, where they get aggressive and salivate and all that. A lot of the skunk and fox strains, it's more like they just kind of pace around in circles, so it can look a little more like distemper.
Okay.
And they're trying to keep the raccoon furious, air quotes, strain from spreading westward.
Right.
So that's what like North Carolina had in West Virginia and some of those states I lived in, and even parts of Ohio and Pennsylvania. And actually Wildlife Services, who is a federal agency that helps with wildlife damage issues and things like that, are doing a lot of efforts to drop baits actually along this line, this north-south line, to try to keep that strain from moving westward.
Right.
So, and so far it's been, I think, fairly successful.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. I don't remember. I think it must have been early 2000s or maybe the late 1990s. They were talking about this moving forward, and they had an anticipated time that it would arrive in Indiana or whatever. And so far, we've been fortunate that it hasn't. Yeah. And I don't even know about Western Ohio, if that's even been the case there. I think it mostly was stopped.
I think they've
further east.
Done an okay job, but please don't move raccoons around the state if you're listening.
Yes. Yeah.
Please don't move raccoons west. We don't want it here.
If you're moving raccoons at all, it's supposed to stay within your county.
In Indiana, yes.
Yeah. In Indiana.
I'm saying if you're in North Carolina, please don't drive raccoons over here. We don't want them. But yeah, the program's been pretty successful so far.
Yeah.
So we don't have a lot of terrestrial rabies come up in some of our animals, but we still do try to test things when we can. If something's suspected, we do still have a rabies lab that does testing and stuff like that. So if there's any trappers out there and they think something has rabies like a raccoon, give us a call because we will try to test them when we can.
Yeah.
Speaking of that, so how do you like working with trappers?
Oh, it's great. Yeah, they're a big part of how we are able to accomplish a lot of the research and management that we do. I was thinking about this the other day because kind of my first exposure to that was when I was a grad student in West Virginia, and I asked trappers to give me stomach contents because we were looking at stomachs and scats from coyotes to try to get a feel for what their diet was, because West Virginia just got coyotes for the late 70s, like around 75, and they really took off in the 90s. So it was a fairly new predator for them, and they really didn't know anything about them. So they're like, well, it's pretty inexpensive to do a diet study. Let's get a student and just kind of see if we need to be specifically worried about any particular animal they're eating, kind of thing. And so they were really, West Virginia Trappers Association were really my first trappers group, and my first experience with how much trappers can help with management, furbearer management, and research efforts and stuff like that. And they gave me some stomachs and some heads and stuff like that as part of that project. And they were a really great group to work with. And I've been very fortunate since then to work with a lot of great trapper groups, the Wisconsin Trappers Association, and all the work they do with trapper education up there.
Right.
And they're doing a lot now they have a deer predator study going on where they're looking at CWD and deer and predators in southwestern Wisconsin. And they're doing a system where trappers call, and when they catch something, a coyote or a bobcat, and then the researchers come out and collar it. And they're getting a lot of animals collared that way. And that's actually the same scenario we're going to attempt to use with gray foxes. If a trapper in Indiana gets a gray fox in one of our 2 collaring areas, they'll be able to call us and we'll come out and put a collar on it, try to give them a gift card for more than the animal's worth kind of thing, and then help us get more collars out on gray foxes than we probably could trap in with just some technicians. So, and then in North Carolina, trappers as well, they were a great group to work with. So they've helped with a lot of things we do and been great advocates for furbearer management. So
obviously I'd like to think that all of us appreciate the resource when we want this to be around.
Hopefully.
And we want this to be around a long time.
Exactly.
So completely sustainable.
Feels good to feel like you're helping,
Yep.
Yeah.
Boots on the ground.
Exactly.
trappers nowadays probably, in the 70s and 80s, trappers would trap from the first day of season through the latter part of the season, and may not miss a day. Of course, now it's like, like we trap in 2 week increments.
Your 2 weeks, you get off work and go out.
Right. So that's really common for people to do. But yeah, they're kind of they are the guys that are out there beating the bushes, so, but.
Yeah, we appreciate a lot of the work that the trappers, like fur takers and the state associations do. And if you're listening to this and you're not a member of one of your state associations or local groups, then make sure to get involved, because that's some of the easiest way for me to spread information as well.
Right.
Like, it's hard for me to contact every single trapper in the state, but it's easy for me to contact the fur takers chapters and the Indiana State Trappers Association and be like, this is happening, or I need help with this, and then them help me spread the words through their membership. So
yeah, I had 2 or 3 phone calls last year, after the proposed Bobcat season. Guys were saying, well, I didn't even know about it at all. And it's like, well,
I don't know how.
Yeah. I mean,
I tried.
And we personally had it on Facebook. We were putting on our email newsletter.
All over
we were doing all this stuff. And this guy's,
it was in the news.
Right.
I mean, mostly because people were unhappy about it, but it was still in the news.
Right.
So.
I mean, the common answer that these guys will say is, well, I don't even have a computer. It's like, well,
that's
so
2019,
right?
Yeah.
2019. If you're not in an association and you don't have a computer,
then you're probably maybe not getting that information.
Exactly. So I understand why you're not getting it, but I'm not. You're the one that's probably going to have to
take a step to try to make sure you are getting that information.
Yeah. So talking about that, population levels. Exact counts.
Yeah, we don't do that.
I know.
We don't like to do that. Our counts are always wrong, man. It's like we can't even census people. I was telling someone this the other day. It's like we spend millions, if not $1 billion, trying to do a person census where
every
we
10
go
years
door
or whatever,
to door every 10 years.
Yeah.
And there's still like a 20% error rate. Like 20% of people don't get actually counted, they think.
Right.
So I can't go door to door with something like a coyote or a bobcat.
That doesn't
ask them how many live with them. So we have some cool techniques to try, but everyone's always going to tell you you're wrong as soon as you try to give them a number. This happened all the time with wolves in Wisconsin when I was up there, because they wouldn't estimate the population. They would estimate the minimum count they thought they had. So it's like based upon all of our surveys, our collaring, our tracking, snow track surveys, all of these howling surveys. They did a lot of surveys for wolves. All of these surveys, we think they're at least this many. And then everyone would tell them they were wrong. And they're like, no, there's not. There's
both sides, right?
Sides.
Yeah.
There either can't nearly be that many, you're idiots, or there is way, way more than that, you're idiots.
Yeah.
Like, there was no one ever happy with the number that they put out there.
Right.
And that was the minimum winter count. So they do that assuming the majority of the population has died if it's going to, and right before they have pups. So they would put out this number, and then the wolves would have pups, and it would double, and then it would go back down, and they would do that again next year. But everybody always thought that was like the number with pups or something. They would always think that they were just wrong across the board. So it's really hard to come up with numbers that people believe. And in some cases, you need it. If you got an endangered species, you have to have a delisting goal, and that has to be numeric, right?
Right.
But for a lot of our more common things like coyotes and raccoons, we try to just look at trends, whether the population's going up, down, or staying the same. And how does that change how we're managing them? Like, do we want them to be going down, but they're going up? And what can we do to make them then go stabilize or track downward a little bit? Like, what options do we have with seasons and harvest regulations and things like that to try to reach the trend that we're trying to achieve? So I don't think I think they try to estimate populations of like bald eagles or something in Indiana, but for none of my species have any kind of population estimate specifically.
I mean, eagles would be a little easier.
Yeah, there's only like 60 of them. So, and they make those giant nests in trees,
right.
And they're giant brown and white birds. So
yeah, you just fly up the river systems, and for the most part. So, but
I see them when I'm kayaking sometimes.
Yeah,
It's pretty cool.
Yeah,
but for most of our things, even deer and stuff, we don't try to actually be like, there are exactly 37,000 of them,
right?
Because
I mean, you're talking about an animal, a coyote, for instance, that could have a potential home range of 10 square miles, where they you only use a third of it. But still, when you got an animal that's moving around that much, are you ever going to count it?
Yeah, and there's been some really interesting research out of Virginia Tech lately about carnivores in some of their Appalachian belt over there. where they have some coyotes that will just never pair up, first of all, and just kind of move wherever it feels like it. They'll have coyotes that'll set home ranges and then will change. And they'll have this period where they're kind of what we call transient, meaning they're not defending a home range.
Hanging
and then
out.
they'll set up a new one. And then there'll some that'll set up a new one and then come back to the old one. And then they'll shift it over slightly. So these things are just constantly changing in the wild.
Right.
These animals are constantly changing, constantly shifting where they're living and stuff like that. And if they lose, for coyotes, they tend to stay with the same mate. If they lose a mate, though, they might become fully transient, or they might stick around and wait for another mate to show up. It really changes a lot. They had collared a coyote in West Virginia, and it went down to North Carolina and came back over like a couple week period, and for no apparent reason. It didn't stay down there. It just ran down to North Carolina and then ran back up to West Virginia.
Yeah.
So these animals also make these big exploratory moves. I don't know if he was going on vacation.
Yeah.
Or like humans do, or what it was doing. But so that stuff is just always changing all the time. The animal populations are very dynamic. There's always animals being removed, and you have the influx, obviously, when they reproduce, but you also have influxes of dispersing animals, right? So we might have, a female might only have 3 pups in an area, but then they might have a coyote come in from eastern Illinois and come over and take part of that territory away from them.
Right.
And it's not one of her direct descendants or anything, but this other dispersing coyote came in and managed to carve out a little space that made their home range smaller, and that kind of stuff is just constantly changing.
Right. I think on the Bobcats, one of the ones that was collared ended up over by St. Louis. I mean, that's quite a trip.
Yeah, we had another one wind up in Grand Rapids, Michigan.
Yeah, that's quite a trip as well. Even
From
further,
South
I think.
Central Indiana.
Yeah.
Yeah, the St. Louis one was a young animal, but I think it was an adult bobcat that wound up in Michigan.
Okay.
And we had several move to Kentucky from South Central Indiana.
So how were they crossing the bridge? A bridge?
Probably.
I mean, I don't know that.
Ice. If
Oh, that's-
something
yeah.
ice is over for a little while, they can cross the ice. Some of the things like bears can swim it, depending on how wide it is. Like when bobcat probably couldn't swim the Ohio River.
Right.
But some of our smaller rivers, bobcats aren't completely averse to the idea of water. Some bobcats, I've seen trail camera images of bobcats diving into ponds after geese for them. So they're not opposed to getting a little wet sometimes, but we think for the most part, bridges and occasionally when things freeze over.
Right. Makes sense.
So, what are your thoughts in terms of harvest levels for Indiana? I kind of get the impression that we're really just generally not catching enough stuff. You know what I mean?
With some things like raccoons and stuff, we could
Right.
be. Because we're having some distemper outbreaks and stuff, and usually if you're having disease outbreaks, that population's probably a little higher than
Right.
it could be, and things like that. And with fur prices, it's hard because it's not really.
Right. There's
There's not the motivation for trappers to go catch raccoons when they're only worth, what was our average here?
$3 or $4,
Yeah,
probably
$4
$5
maybe.
maybe. Yeah. So.
So
The thing about it is, most guys will go out and catch a few, but as far as just having the motivation to just go out and work that hard, it's pretty
to
tough.
really bring the population down.
Yeah.
It's tough.
It's one of those things that's it's hard to explain why people actually trap and have the lifestyle of a trapper, unless you're there's a lot of things that factor into that.
Yeah.
And of course, the side benefit is the management of the species, which is
that's a
very
big benefit
important.
to me.
Yeah.
And also all the data I collect.
Right.
I collect a lot of data from my animals just because we do have harvest on them.
Yeah. So and it's interesting too. The trappers that trap species to protect endangered species as well. I don't know that really happens in Indiana per se, but certainly happens on the East Coast.
Yeah, I'm not
in
aware
some
of
places.
a specific situation in Indiana, but things like piping plovers over on the
Right.
coast.
Right.
They're trapping, raccoons and stuff to.
And red
But
foxes,
there
I
might be
think, are pretty hard on
specific
stuff. Yeah.
instances where that happens. Like we have a crawfish frog research project going on right now, which if you don't know what that is, Google it. But they're a neat little wetland frog that is has limited distribution in Indiana. And they have set up this, what they call a drift fence to try to catch and tag them and see how the populations are doing at one of our fish and wildlife properties. And it's basically a continuous fence with buckets along it that you loop a wetland basically where the frogs are trying to get to. And you set these buckets in the ground. So the frog will hit the fence, bounce along the front fence, trying to find an opening to get to the pond, and it'll fall into a bucket. And then the researcher can come out and grab it and tag it and take measurements and do all that kind of stuff. But when they're doing that, guess what would be ripe for a bunch of raccoons to eat some tasty crawfish frogs?
Yeah, exactly.
Buckets full of crawfish frogs. So there might be a scenario where we have to make sure that
Catch some
we're
critters.
catching a few raccoons around that site to make sure they're not snacking on all of our crawfish frogs.
I'm assuming a tick-eating possum would probably eat a crawfish frog too.
Yeah. I bet a skunk would too, but I don't know if they'd be able to get them out of the bucket very easily because they don't have the reach a raccoon does.
Yeah,
So.
yeah.
But yeah, so there's that's an Indiana-specific situation where we would probably need to catch some raccoons to protect something else we're trying to do some
Right.
research on. But
Right.
yeah, piping plovers are a big one out east, which are a bird that nests on beaches, and raccoons and foxes and coyotes will come onto the beaches and clear all the eggs out of them and stuff like that. So
Right.
they do some work to remove some predators there. And there's some sea turtle, I think, where they're doing the same thing.
Yeah.
Stuff like that. So
That's one of the presentations at the Trappers College is Robert Colonna does a presentation on that where they talks about the level of trapping that's done as a protective measure for those endangered species.
Yeah, absolutely.
But
one of the key messages for trappers, which is some research, that human dimensions research that was done to figure out what messages resonate with a non-trapping public to keep them supportive of the idea of trapping. And, one of the big ones is it doesn't cause species to become threatened or endangered, and
Right.
the animals that are trapped are abundant. But another one is that trapping provides a lot of benefits. And that's an example of one of the benefits that regulated trapping provides, is
Sure.
it can help endangered species. It also helps us restore species, as we talked about with river otter. Without that number 11, we wouldn't have river otter in Indiana, right?
correct.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
So it's trapping provides a lot of benefits. That's one of the talking points. If you haven't seen the key messages for trappers, you should go on the fishwildlife.com and look them up.
Right.
Because they're very helpful. Because trying to tell someone that, well, this is my heritage, if you don't have that same heritage, that won't resonate with you, right? You won't understand why.
Right.
It's like, what is it? There's this, like, in Minnesota, every New Year, they eat this weird salted herring and pickled in vinegar, and they're like, this is our heritage. I'm like, I don't care, that's gross. Like, I ain't eating your weird salted fish I don't care what day it is. So, like, I just don't, that doesn't resonate with me because I
Right.
am not of that cultural heritage. And it's kind of the same thing with trapping. If you don't do it, just saying things like, well, it's what we've always done doesn't resonate with people, but
Right.
stuff like it provides a lot of benefits, and the species are abundant and won't cause them to become threatened or endangered does resonate with people.
Sure.
So.
Right.
Sure. So I guess where do you see the future of all of this going? Because we do have a fair amount of people that don't appreciate what we do.
Yep.
And I know that's a perspective. It's what your thoughts are.
Mm-hmm.
Anyways.
Yeah, it's hard because trapping is such a small niche.
Right.
Right. 'Cause a lot of people, if you ask them, they know someone who hunts, but they may not know someone who traps. I have 4,000 licensed trappers in Indiana. In other states, I think North Carolina was about half that. Wisconsin was like 20,000 who bought a license, but
Right.
so there's regional differences there. But the chance of a neutral person who isn't swayed one way or the other, knowing someone who traps is a lot lower probability than finding someone who hunts and that they could talk to about why do people do
Right.
this thing.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we're going to, continue to see people who don't understand what we do. And I think trappers may not like this, but I think our trappers need to be better at communicating.
Right.
You need to stop, being, the image of the trapper is secretive loner,
Right.
Who's just in the woods and catching things. And I think trappers need to be better at talking about why trapping is important and using, like I said, some of those key messages that we know resonate with people, like
Right.
some of the benefits it provides.
What was that? What's that web address again?
It was
Definitely.
fishwildlife.org. They have a Furbearer section, and there's a handy little note card in there. There's a couple of key ones, like the species are abundant, doesn't cause them to be threatened or endangered. The regulations are scientifically based and strictly enforced, because
Right.
a lot of people still think it's a free-for-all.
Right. It's
Like a trapper can just go out and do whatever he wants, wherever
Unregulated.
he wants, completely unregulated.
Not
And
true.
we all know that's not true. We all deal with regulations all the time.
right. Right.
So telling them that it's, science-based and highly regulated, telling them that it provides a lot of benefits, those are kind of the key things that we need as trappers need to be a little better about relating to just people that we know or people that we meet who find out that we're trappers, and trying to communicate that a little better, because we're going to get increasing pressure about why are we still doing this. And, my agency really supports regulated trapping because it is an important management tool for us, and it is something we really use for research and data collection. So we're on board, but there's a lot of people out there who are like, I don't know about this.
Right.
What's this all about? And there's also obviously groups who are going to be opposed to it no matter what we do. But they've actually done a little bit of research on perceptions of trapping it was Wisconsin, Indiana, and Connecticut. And Indiana's rate of people who were supportive of the idea of trapping for the right reasons was in the 70% range. That's pretty good.
Right.
That's pretty high. That could easily tip down very quickly if people are out there being unethical and irresponsible and kind of giving trappers a bad name. But if we can kind of get the message out there that some of these key messages about why it's important.
I'm going to put a direct link in the description of this. If you're listening, look in the description area. There'll be a link straight to that.
That'd be great. So I think we just need to be better at communicating some of the reasons why.
Right.
Why this is important and why we need to maintain this. We might also have to see shifts where we change regulations just because the public perception of doing that thing is no longer very supported. So we might see some regulation changes in that vein. Now, I don't know if I have a specific example of that, but I feel like one of my jobs is to make sure we maintain trapping into the future. And that may occasionally mean having to do something because it looks really bad to the public, and rather than losing all of trapping, we make something a little more restrictive kind of thing. So thinking about that and thinking about states increasing trapper education. One of the Wisconsin had mandatory trapper education, and they have a wonderful trapper education program up there. A lot of states don't have that, but some are moving toward it, because we used that as a reference point a lot in Wisconsin of people who are like, well, why don't we ban all of this? And one of the talking points that they can use is we have mandatory education for all trappers. We are trying to teach everyone to be responsible and ethical before they go out and set traps.
Right.
So I maybe see a shift in having to increase maybe mandatory trapper education kind of thing to use that as a defense and make sure trappers know, young trappers especially, first-time trappers know all the rules and regulations and the ethics things before they get out there and start setting traps so they can be a positive public image for regulated trapping.
I mean, a lot of times issues, not just in trapping but in hunting or whatever, relate to things that are illegal anyways.
Yep.
They're off the norm of trapping. They're guys that are doing stuff that they're not supposed to be doing. So
there's always a bad apple out there ruining it for everybody else that's doing the right thing.
What do you see in the news stories? It's not like wonderful trapper does everything he's supposed to. It's
right.
This guy broke the law kind of stuff. So it's hard to get public or positive information out there. Make sure we're combating that.
The one that I scratch your head and appreciate at the same time, and it's all the people that are, say, an urban transplant, they move to the country and they, for instance, have beavers show up or the coyotes are eating their cat or whatever, and at first, particularly if it's beavers, a lot of times they'll say, well, that is really cool. I've got beavers in my pond. Well, a couple, 3 days later, they're decorative trees that they planted, or their trees in general just start coming down, and then it's like, they need to go. I don't care what it takes. Kill all of them. It just goes from like literally one extreme to the next once they have firsthand experience with that animal. So it's
we're just something I as a biologist struggle against too, is making sure people don't devalue wildlife because they're causing problems, because then they're just seen as vermin and they don't have value, when all of our wildlife has value.
Right, exactly.
But people, when they have problems, it just devalues that animal in their eyes, and it's like, a coyote ate my cat, all coyotes are scum for the rest of the time. So trying to combat this idea of that coyote still has value and still is important for our ecosystem and still provides some services, even though it did snack on your cat. I'm sorry about that, but it definitely will happen sometimes. So
and that same
tough.
thing, and
they're just doing what they're built to do. I mean,
and the other thing is, if something's got a monetary value, then if it's regulated, then it actually is going to be taken care of even more than something that doesn't have a monetary. And you can say unfortunately or fortunately on that one, but I mean, it's kind of the way it is, So, but Africa's a good example of that. But anyways.
Yes, how some animals have. You can pay to hunt them, and that actually goes into supporting wildlife conservation, but that means those animals are being hunted and taken out of the population too. And
Right, but in areas where they would say would shut down hunting or they wouldn't allow hunting, then poachers would come in. They didn't have anything to protect. There was no resources to protect
them,
anything.
to
I
put
mean, it was
money
just
into protecting them,
yeah. That was kind of a vicious. Well, not even a cycle. It was just like shut it down, then
Yeah, it was a big problem.
yeah. So
yeah, and that's the thing. If we start losing a bunch of our license fees, we don't have another great mechanism for funding right now.
right,
So where are we getting money to try to still manage these animals if stuff like that goes away? And one of the things we do need to do is try to tap into more funding sources for user groups. Hunters and trappers have been bearing the brunt for a long time, but I think we're moving to a point where we're trying to get more user groups involved and trying to fund conservation, because we really don't want to. We want to have enough resources to be able to successfully manage and research these animals and stuff like that. So.
sure. And I'm going to probably get some flack for this, but a hunting license or a trapping license is actually very reasonable.
Yeah.
It's a bargain.
I was just listening. Do you listen to Meat Eater podcast?
Yeah.
The American Prairie Reserve one?
Yeah.
Where it's like $90 to get a daily pass for ski lift, but it's $10 to hunt elk for 4 months out west.
Yeah, and then
comparatively
you go
cheap.
by and you don't think much about. Well, maybe you do, but you buy $250 pair of boots, and you buy an expensive gun, and a dozen traps cost $200, and all this stuff, what it costs, and somebody's going to bulk overspending $17 on a license or whatever they cost.
Yeah.
It's just like.
I get the hunt trap combo for $25.
Yeah.
It's not bad.
Hunt fish.
Or that's
The
the hunt fish.
combo. That's probably
They
a
need to
little
lump a trap one
too
all
not
together.
bad.
That'd be great.
Yeah. So I mean, it's kind of like, it's such a bargain.
Yeah.
And for what that's the basis of what we do is that resource.
Mm-hmm.
So you would think that our perspective would be to invest in it further. So, but yeah,
we're pretty reasonable license fees comparatively.
Right. And I kind of get it that it's political too.
Yeah.
No administration wants to see license increase during their time.
Yeah, that's
So.
the issue. The idea of it's not a tax, but thinking of it like a tax, there's some hesitancy to
Right.
kind of explore some of those options. So.
Right. So.
But there are some Indiana groups who are trying to do their part to work with the legislature to find other revenue sources. And if you're interested in that as a cause, then you can search those out. So
Right. So.
About ready to wrap this up.
Got any
I don't
final?
know how long we've been talking, but we
A
have
while.
any other points we wanted to hit.
It's about an hour and a half.
Oh,
Pretty
geez,
good.
okay. Yeah,
Pretty
that's
good.
not bad. You can always have me back. We can talk some more.
I think we talked about some good key topics, and I learned a lot. Did you learn something, Charlie?
I didn't learn anything. I knew.
he knows it all.
I knew all this.
He knows it all.
You knew about the frogs?
No, I did
like,
not.
did
I never
you
even heard of
know about Crawfish Frog Project?
I never even heard about a.
Just started yesterday. How do you know about
I
this?
didn't even know about that. I never even heard of a crawfish frog. So
I was getting hungry. I love eating crawfish. And then crawfish frog.
Crawfish frog legs? I wonder if those would taste the same. They're protected. Please don't eat them.
I know.
no, it was an interesting discussion, and I did learn a lot, and I appreciate
Yes.
Geriann.
Thanks for being on the
And
show.
we'll have to do a part 2 follow up at
Yeah,
some
definitely
point.
bring
So
me back anytime.
Yeah.
We can make it a yearly thing or something after this first sale every year. We talk about whatever news is happening.
yeah, that'd be awesome. So
Well, thanks for having me.
Yeah, appreciate it.
As always, thanks for everyone for tuning in, and we'll see you next time. We'll have another episode coming out. Details about the 7B fur sale that we just got done with today. So stay tuned.